On the last Thursday of every single month, a plane touches down at Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston. It carries no tourists. It carries no returning students, no vacationers coming home with duty-free bags and sunburns. It carries Jamaicans who have just been deported from the United States, some of them after living there for 30 years, some of them with children who are American citizens, some of them with nothing waiting for them on the island except the clothes on their back and a country they barely remember. This has been happening for years, but something changed. And once you understand what changed and why, you will understand one of the most important stories in the Caribbean right now, a story about a small island nation that decided it was done being treated as an afterthought by the most powerful country on earth. This is the story of how Jamaica turned its back on America, not in anger, not with a slammed door, but with something far more consequential, a quiet, deliberate decision to stop depending on a relationship that had stopped being a partnership. For 60 years, Jamaica and the United States have shared something close to family ties, trade routes worn smooth by decades of use, military cooperation that predates most of the people reading headlines about it today. Millions of American tourists who have never known a Caribbean vacation that wasn't a Jamaican one, and a diaspora so large and so woven into American life that most people don't even think to ask where it came from. That is the relationship that has been quietly cracking apart over the past 18 months. Not through a single dramatic rupture, but through a slow accumulation of decisions made in Washington, each one landing on Jamaican families like another stone, added to a weight they were already carrying. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why Washington is watching Jamaica so closely right now, and why what happens on this island over the next few years could set the pattern for how dozens of small nations deal with great powers for decades to come. This isn't a story you'll find covered with much depth anywhere else, and the details matter more than the headlines ever could. Let's start with the date that changed everything. January the 21st, 2026. On that day, the United States Department of State paused all immigrant visa processing for Jamaican citizens indefinitely. Jamaica was not alone. 75 countries were affected by similar measures. But for Jamaicans, both on the island and across the diaspora in New York, Miami, Toronto, and London, this one landed differently. It felt personal. The official explanation from Washington was that Jamaican applicants presented, in the government's words, a high risk of becoming a public charge, meaning a risk of relying on government assistance once inside the United States. Now sit with that claim for a moment, because the numbers tell a very different story. In 2025 alone, Jamaicans living in the United States sent home $3.49 billion in remittances. $3.49 billion in a single year, flowing from Jamaican hands in America into Jamaican households on the island. That is not the financial profile of a population at risk of dependency. That is the financial profile of a population holding up an entire national economy from thousands of miles away. There are more than 1.5 million people of Jamaican descent living in the United States today. They are not an abstraction. They are nurses working double shifts in New York hospitals. They are small business owners in Miami who employ American workers and pay American taxes. They are teachers standing in front of American classrooms in Atlanta, shaping the next generation of American children. Colin Powell, the first black Secretary of State in American history, was the son of Jamaican immigrants. Kamala Harris, the first woman to serve as Vice President of the United States, has Jamaican heritage on her father's side. Patrick Ewing, one of the most dominant centers in the history of the NBA, was born in Kingston before his family moved to Boston. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jamaican nurses were among the healthcare workers who stayed on hospital floors in New York and New Jersey when staffing shortages left entire units short-handed, at a time when many facilities were struggling to keep beds covered at all. That is not a footnote. That is the kind of labor that keeps a healthcare system standing during its worst moment, provided by a community a government policy paper had quietly flagged as a potential liability. So when a policy paper in Washington describes this community as a potential burden, it is worth asking a very simple question. Over the last year, who exactly has been sending money to support whom? That question is going to come up again and again in this story, because it sits underneath almost everything that has happened between these two countries over the past 18 months. The visa freeze was not an isolated decision, it was the first domino. On April 2, 2025, President Trump stood in the White House Rose Garden and announced what his administration branded Liberation Day, a sweeping new round of tariffs affecting countries across the globe. The Caribbean, despite decades of being treated as a low-priority, low-risk trading partner, was not spared. Jamaica was hit with a 10% tariff on its exports to the United States. 10% might not sound dramatic if you are not familiar with how fragile small island economies actually are, so let's put it in context. Since 1984, Caribbean nations have operated under the Caribbean Basin Initiative, a framework that allowed goods like rum, coffee, and manufactured products to move into American markets duty-free. That arrangement was not charity. It was strategy, built during the Cold War to keep the region economically stable and politically aligned with Washington. For 40 years it held. In a single afternoon in the Rose Garden, that 40-year foundation cracked, and Jamaica, relatively speaking, got off easy. Guyana was hit with a 38% tariff. The signal sent across the region was impossible to misread. Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley called the tariffs a blindsiding blow to the region's economic stability. The CARICOM private sector organization estimated the Caribbean stood to lose more than $500 million a year because of them. For a region where individual economies are often smaller than a mid-sized American city's annual budget, $500 million is not an abstract inconvenience. It is the difference between a hospital getting new equipment and a hospital going without. It is the difference between a road getting paved and a road staying broken for another 5 years. Small economies do not have the cushion that larger ones do, and everyone making policy in these Caribbean capitals knows it. Then came the deportations, and this is where the story stops being about spreadsheets and starts being about families. By late 2024, more than 5,000 Jamaicans had active deportation orders in the United States, more than any other Caribbean nation, and more combined than Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, Barbados, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent put together. In January 2025, the first deportation flight of the year landed in Kingston, carrying roughly 50 people. By May, that number had swelled. 107 Jamaicans arrived on a single flight, the largest deportation flight in recent memory. Some of the people on that plane had spent decades building lives in the United States. Some had American-born children who would now grow up without a parent in the house. Some had criminal records. Many did not. Their only offense an overstayed visa or a paperwork delay that stretched on for years inside an overwhelmed immigration system. Jamaica's Foreign Affairs Minister, Kamina Johnson-Smith, confirmed that roughly 4,000 Jamaicans held final deportation orders in the U.S. at the time, with about 2,500 confirmed for removal. Every one of those flights represents a negotiation Jamaica has almost no leverage in. Under international law, a country is obligated to accept its own citizens when another nation deports them. Jamaica has no real choice here. What it does have a choice about is everything that happens next, how it treats those returning citizens, and how it responds to everything else Washington has been doing. Picture what that Thursday actually looks like on the ground in Kingston. Families gathered outside the airport, some reuniting with a parent or sibling they haven't seen in decades, others meeting a relative for the first time, a child who grew up hearing stories about a country that exists now only in memory and photographs. Jamaica has had to build reintegration programs almost from scratch, helping returning citizens find housing, work, and a sense of footing in a country that, for many of them, feels less like home and more like a place they're starting over in. That is the human cost sitting underneath every one of these policy decisions, the part that doesn't show up in a State Department press release. And then, in late February 2026, something happened that took this entire situation from economic friction to open diplomatic tension. At the 50th regular meeting of CARICOM heads of government in St. Kitts, Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness addressed the deepening crisis in Cuba, the fuel shortages, the economic collapse, the humanitarian strain on ordinary Cuban families. He warned, carefully and diplomatically, that a prolonged crisis in Cuba would not stay contained within Cuba's borders. It would spill outward, affecting migration patterns, regional security, and economic stability across the entire Caribbean, Jamaica included. It was measured. It was the kind of statement regional leaders make constantly, grounded in geography and shared consequence rather than ideology. But the response from Washington was immediate and sharp. Congressman Carlos Gimenez, a Cuban-born Republican from Florida, posted publicly, accusing Jamaica's governing party of shielding what he called a moribund dictatorship in Havana. Then he added a line that stopped Caribbean diplomats cold. Jamaica, he said, will face the consequences. A sitting member of the United States Congress had just publicly threatened a soft Caribbean nation for making a humanitarian observation about a neighboring country's crisis. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of moment regional governments remember for a generation. If you're finding this breakdown useful, this is a good point to hit subscribe. This channel exists to walk through stories like this one carefully, with the sourcing and context that a lot of coverage skips past. We are working toward 10,000 subscribers, and every person who subscribes genuinely helps us keep producing work like this. If you've been following our coverage of Jamaica for a while, you already know we take the time to get the details right, and that only happens because of people like you. And once you've done that, I want to hear from you in the comments. Given what you just heard about the Cuba remarks, do you think Prime Minister Holness's comments were reasonable diplomatic caution, or do you think he knew exactly what kind of reaction they would provoke? Now here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Because while all of this was unfolding, visa freezes, tariffs, deportation flights, a congressman's public threat, Jamaica was doing something almost nobody outside of financial and diplomatic circles was paying attention to. It was quietly building an entirely different set of relationships, and the scale of what it has built should reshape how you think about this entire situation. China has invested more than $2.1 billion into Jamaica through a combination of loans and infrastructure projects over the past decade and a half. The North-South Highway, completed in 2016, was financed by a $457 million loan from the China Development Bank and constructed by China Harbor Engineering Company. It connects Ocho Rios on the north coast to Kingston in the south, and it fundamentally changed how people and goods move across the island. That project was not the end of the relationship, it was the beginning. Chinese state-linked firms have since been involved in road rehabilitation, port development, and urban revitalization projects across Jamaica. The South Coastal Road Reconstruction and Upgrade Project, financed through the Export-Import Bank of China, is currently improving traffic capacity along the island's southeastern coast. And in one of the more striking developments of the last few years, officials from China's Gansu province signaled readiness to invest up to $6 billion into an industrial park and special economic zone in Nain, St. Elizabeth. If that project is fully realized, it would be the single largest foreign investment in Jamaica's history. It would be easy to look at those numbers and assume Jamaica is simply swapping one dependency for another, trading an American leash for a Chinese one. That is a fair question to ask, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissive one. Critics of these arrangements in Jamaica and elsewhere in the region have pointed to examples in other parts of the world where Chinese infrastructure financing came with loan terms that left smaller nations struggling to repay what they'd borrowed. That risk is real, and it is one Jamaican economists and opposition politicians have raised publicly. Jamaica's own finance officials have said the loans it has taken on remain within manageable debt servicing levels, but the conversation about how much foreign infrastructure debt is too much is an ongoing one on the island, not a settled question. But listen to how Prime Minister Holness actually frames these projects. This is not just about a road, he said. This is about Jamaica achieving economic and political independence. That sentence is the key to understanding everything else in this story. Jamaica is not choosing China over America. Jamaica is choosing to have options. It is choosing a position where no single foreign power can threaten consequences and expect automatic compliance, because there is always another door open somewhere else. And Jamaica is not doing this alone. In July 2025, Jamaica became the 13th CARICOM member state to formally join Afrexim Bank, the Pan-African Export-Import Bank, headquartered in Cairo. This was not symbolic. It unlocked $1.5 billion in dedicated funding for Jamaica, part of a broader $3 billion program extended across CARICOM nations, earmarked for infrastructure, energy, ports, telecommunications, and small business development. It represents a financial relationship that runs through Cairo rather than Washington, through Lagos rather than New York. At the signing ceremony, Afrexim Bank Chairman Professor Benedict Orama spoke about reconnecting African and Caribbean economies that share deep historical roots, but have remained institutionally disconnected for generations. Both Prime Minister Holness and Foreign Affairs Minister Johnson Smith attended in person, a signal of exactly how seriously Jamaica takes this new relationship. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment, a Jamaican Prime Minister standing in Cairo sealing a financial partnership with an African-led institution at the exact moment his government was absorbing visa restrictions and tariffs from Washington. That is not a coincidence of timing. That is a deliberate signal about where Jamaica sees its future options expanding. CARICOM Chair Mia Mottley has been even more direct about the strategic thinking behind all of this. She has laid out what amounts to a 4-point regional survival plan. First, deepen ties with Africa, Latin America, and other partners beyond the traditional Western relationships. Second, pursue agricultural self-sufficiency, because a region that cannot feed itself will always be vulnerable to outside pressure. Third, protect regional unity, because Caribbean nations turning on each other for short-term political gain only benefits outside powers looking to divide and manage the region. Fourth, buy local and buy regional, turning everyday consumer decisions into acts of economic solidarity. Motley put it simply, the products are better, fresher, and more competitive in many instances, she said. Why should we import what we can grow ourselves? This is not anti-American sentiment. This is what happens when small nations conclude they can no longer afford to keep all of their economic security in one basket held by one partner. Now here is where the hypocrisy in Washington's own position becomes almost impossible to ignore. While the visa freeze was in effect, while tariffs were being announced, while deportation flights were landing monthly, another policy was quietly moving through Congress that would extract even more money out of the Caribbean. The legislation known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act originally proposed a 5% tax on remittances sent abroad. After negotiations, that figure was reduced to 1%. Even at 1%, the impact on Jamaica would be significant. If Jamaicans in America send home roughly $3.5 billion a year, a 1% tax means $35 million redirected to the U.S. Treasury instead of Jamaican households. $35 million that would no longer be paying school fees, covering medical bills, or supporting small businesses on the island. Karen Dunkley, a former member of the Jamaica Diaspora Advisory Board, called the measure not just questionable economics, but, in her words, a strain on the shared bonds between the two countries. She pointed out that with remittances representing close to 20% of Jamaica's GDP, a policy like this carries real ripple effects, deepening financial strain on households and weakening the connective tissue between the diaspora and the homeland. Think about what a policy like that actually asks of an ordinary Jamaican-American family. Someone working a full-time job in Brooklyn or Miami, already paying federal, state, and local taxes on every dollar they earn, then wants to send $200 home to help a parent cover a light bill or a grandmother cover a prescription. Under this policy, a portion of that transfer, money that has already been taxed once as income, gets taxed again simply for crossing a border toward family. It is a policy that treats an act of care as a taxable transaction, so consider the full picture. The same government voicing concern that Jamaicans might become financially dependent on the United States was, at the same time, moving to tax the money that Jamaicans in America were sending home to their own families, money earned through their own labor. Who, again, has been extracting wealth from whom? And yet, despite all of this, Jamaica's response has been notably restrained. Prime Minister Holness has not responded with hostility or inflammatory rhetoric. When asked about the U.S. operation that led to the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in early January, Holness chose his words with visible care. We are living in changing times, uncertain times, uncharted waters in many instances, he said. My job is to keep Jamaica safe, not to steer into waters for which we don't have to go, not to invite problems on ourselves when we have our own problems to deal with. When pressed on the visa freeze, Holness acknowledged something that many leaders would be reluctant to say publicly, that small states like Jamaica have limited leverage when a superpower makes unilateral decisions. But he followed that acknowledgement with something more pointed. We will pursue diplomatic channels, he said, but we are going to pursue even more, making our country the place of choice to live, work, do business, raise families, and retire in paradise. That is not the language of a government that has given up. It's the language of a government that has decided the most effective response to external pressure is building resilience at home rather than escalating conflict abroad. And there are signs the strategy may be having an effect. In late January 2026, the U.S. State Department lowered Jamaica's travel advisory from Level 3, reconsider travel, down to Level 2, exercise increased caution, placing Jamaica in the same advisory category as France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Belgium. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had pledged to reassess the advisory during a visit to Kingston in March 2025, following meetings with Prime Minister Holness. The advisory still references crime concerns and the lingering effects of Hurricane Melissa, but the overall message to American travelers softened considerably. A meaningful shift for a country where tourism remains one of the largest pillars of the economy and where over 4 million visitors arrived in 2023 alone. For context, a Level 3 advisory is often enough on its own to depress bookings, since many travel insurers, cruise lines, and even some school and church groups treat it as an informal line they won't cross. Moving down to Level 2 doesn't just soften language in a State Department document. It can move real dollars, reopening a segment of American travelers who had quietly crossed Jamaica off their list without ever announcing it publicly. Speaking of Hurricane Melissa, there is a chapter of this story that reveals something about the Jamaican diaspora that no visa policy or tariff schedule can capture. Hurricane Melissa made landfall in western Jamaica on October the 28th, 2025, as a Category 5 storm. The World Bank estimated roughly $8.8 billion in damage, equivalent to about 41% of Jamaica's entire 2024 GDP. More than 156,000 homes were damaged, with 24,000 considered total losses. The Planning Institute of Jamaica projected an 11 to 13% contraction in GDP for the final quarter of the year. Tourism, one of the island's economic lifelines, collapsed almost overnight across the western parishes. Entire communities that depended on hotel jobs, tour operations, and restaurant work watched their income disappear within a single news cycle. For families in parishes like Westmoreland and St. James, this wasn't a distant economic statistic. It was a roof that needed rebuilding, a small guest house that had taken a family a decade to build now sitting in ruins, a livelihood that had to be reconstructed from nothing while the rest of the world moved on to the next headline. And then something happened that tells you everything about who actually shows up when Jamaica is in crisis. Remittances to Jamaica had been declining for 3 consecutive years heading into 2025. In November, in the immediate aftermath of the storm, remittances were actually down 4.6% year-over-year, as the disruption to daily life on the island slowed everything down. But by December, the picture had reversed dramatically. Net remittance inflows climbed to $315.3 million, a 13.6% increase compared to December of the previous year, the largest single monthly jump recorded that entire year, driven by a $36.2 million surge in gross inflows, as Jamaicans abroad sent money home for relief, rebuilding, and recovery. The same population that Washington's own visa policy described as a potential drain on public resources responded to their homeland's worst natural disaster in a generation by sending hundreds of millions of dollars home within weeks. That is not the behavior of people looking to take. That is the behavior of people who never stopped considering Jamaica home, no matter how many years they have lived abroad. There is a deeper history behind this dynamic, one worth understanding if you want to make sense of why this moment matters so much. For more than a century, the United States has treated the Caribbean as something close to its backyard, a region where American strategic and commercial interests took precedence, and where Caribbean nations largely had to accept that arrangement because they had no meaningful alternative. Access to American markets, American tourism dollars, and American investment was not optional, it was survival. This goes back further than most people realize. American interest in the region intensified sharply after the Spanish-American War at the turn of the 20th century, and for decades afterward, Washington treated interventions across the Caribbean and Central America as a matter of routine business, not exception. Jamaica itself, as a former British colony that gained independence in 1962, entered the post-war era already navigating a relationship with the United States, shaped by that broader regional pattern. one where economic access came bundled with expectations about political alignment. But that calculation has been shifting. China now offers infrastructure financing without the political conditions historically attached to Western aid packages. Afrexim Bank has opened a financial channel connecting the Caribbean directly to African markets and capital. CARICOM, as a bloc, has been finding a more coordinated and confident voice in how it responds to outside pressure, and a newer generation of Caribbean leadership, Wholeness among them, has stopped operating on the assumption that small nations must simply absorb whatever larger nations decide to do to them. Prime Minister Wholeness said it plainly. Jamaica has always been consistent and has always been the strong voice of reason for small developing countries globally, and continues to be, he said. This is not us recoiling from our principles and duties. What is happening here is not Jamaica turning against the United States out of anger. It is Jamaica insisting on being treated as a partner rather than a dependent, on a relationship that benefits both sides rather than one. And here is the part of this story that should genuinely concern policymakers in Washington, whether or not they are willing to say so publicly. If Jamaica's strategy works, if it successfully diversifies its economic relationships, strengthens regional cooperation, and demonstrates that a small nation can push back on unilateral pressure from a superpower without economic collapse, every other small nation watching will take notes. And they are watching. Small states across Africa, the Pacific, and Southeast Asia are paying close attention to how this plays out, because if a nation of under 3 million people in the Caribbean can hold its ground, that changes the calculation for a lot of governments who have long assumed they had no real choice but to comply. That is the deeper reason this story matters so much more than a visa policy or a tariff schedule would suggest on the surface. This is not really a story about Jamaica and the United States. It's a story about whether the old rules of great power influence still apply in a world where small nations increasingly have other options. So where does this leave things? Jamaica is not walking away from the United States. It continues to maintain diplomatic channels, and it continues to accept the deportation flights it is obligated under international law to accept, while working to support returning citizens as they rebuild their lives on the island. It continues to lobby against measures like the remittance tax, even as it deepens its financial ties elsewhere. And it continues rebuilding from Hurricane Melissa. As of late 2025, roughly 70% of the island's hotel room inventory was back online, with projections to reach 80% by February 2026, and tourism officials expressing cautious optimism that visitor numbers will gradually approach pre-hurricane levels by the end of this year. For American travelers considering a visit, that means Jamaica remains open, accessible, and, by every account, as beautiful as it has ever been. The advisory has been lowered. The airports are operating. The resorts are rebuilding parish by parish. And for the more than 1.5 million Jamaican Americans across the diaspora, the bond with home has, if anything, only deepened. When the hurricane hit, hundreds of millions of dollars flowed back to the island within weeks. Not because any government demanded it, but because that is simply what the relationship between diaspora and homeland has always meant in Jamaican culture. The larger question, the one that will likely take years rather than months to answer, is whether the relationship between Jamaica and the United States can be rebuilt on more equal footing. Whether Washington comes to recognize that treating Caribbean nations as genuine partners produces better long-term outcomes than treating them as territories to be managed. Whether American policymakers fully grasp that in a world with more than one major power willing to invest the Caribbean, small nations now have leverage they simply did not have a generation ago. Nobody can answer that with certainty right now, not with confidence, and anyone who tells you they can is guessing. What is clear is that Jamaica is not backing down, and it is not lashing out either. Prime Minister Wholeness has said Jamaica took its position on these issues well before other nations had even begun to articulate theirs. The country intends to keep pursuing diplomacy with Washington while simultaneously building the kind of internal strength that makes a small nation less vulnerable to external pressure in the first place. And that may be the most important lesson sitting inside this entire story. The most effective answer to outside pressure is not always confrontation, and it is not capitulation either. Often it is quieter than both. It's strengthening your own institutions. It's diversifying who you depend on. It's investing in the people and infrastructure that let a country stand on its own, regardless of what a larger power decides to do on any given Tuesday in Washington. Consider what this actually looks like in practice over the next several years. It looks like new port capacity funded through Cairo rather than Washington. It looks like agricultural investment aimed at feeding the island's own population rather than importing food that could be grown at home. It looks like a diaspora that keeps sending money home, not because a treaty requires it, but because family still means what it has always meant. And it looks like a government that has learned, the hard way, that diplomatic goodwill alone was never going to be enough to guarantee fair treatment from a much larger power. Jamaica is attempting exactly that, in real time, under real pressure, with real consequences for millions of families on both sides of this relationship. Whether it succeeds fully or only partially, it is one of the more consequential experiments happening anywhere in the world right now, a test of whether a small nation can genuinely chart an independent course in the 21st century. There is also a broader lesson here for anyone watching from outside the Caribbean entirely. The assumption that small nations must simply accept the terms set by larger ones has quietly defined international relations for most of modern history. What Jamaica is demonstrating, whether it fully succeeds or not, is that assumption is no longer automatically true. The tools available to a small country in 2026, diversified trade partnerships, alternative financial institutions, a globally connected diaspora, regional coordination through bodies like CARICOM simply did not exist in the same form even 15 years ago. That shift matters far beyond this one relationship. This has been a story about visa policy and tariffs and remittance taxes and diplomatic threats. But underneath all of that, it has really been a story about sovereignty, about dignity, and about whether size determines destiny in international relations, or whether it doesn't have to anymore. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening between Jamaica and the United States, consider subscribing. We're building toward 10,000 subscribers on this channel, and this kind of research-driven coverage only continues because people choose to stick around for it. If you appreciate documentaries that take the time to look past the headlines and into the actual numbers, sources, and human stories behind them, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss the next one. I'd also genuinely like to know what you think. Do you believe Jamaica's strategy of diversifying its partnerships is the right long-term approach for a small nation facing pressure from a larger one? Or do you think there's real risk in leaning too heavily on relationships with China and other new partners? And if you have family who has lived through the deportation process, the remittance changes, or Hurricane Melissa's aftermath, I would genuinely like to hear that perspective in the comments below. Those conversations are often the most valuable part of putting a story like this together, and I do read them. Jamaica's next chapter is still being written, but one thing is already clear. It is being written on Jamaica's own terms.